Alright guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in Leviticus, and it is a challenge to study this book. I am not going to lie, it is a challenge only because, first of all, it's really not written to us. It is written for the priests. As I said before, it is the priest's operating manual. So it's not for us. What we get out of this now, as a matter of history, looking back, we see the holiness of God. We see God's moral standards, righteous standards. But we would not have read this book. In other words, what is being, commanded here is also taught in other parts of the law. The point is that we have the commands for the priests and how they were to operate. So I'm reading through fast to some again of this. I'm going to try to finish the book of Leviticus today. We will see. All right. We left off in chapter 25. I'm going to pick that back up, and in verse 32, and I'm just going to move on. This is a long chapter, but then just some of this stuff is just, we'll see when we go through. Verse 32, concerning the Levitical cities, the Levites always have a right to redeem houses in the cities they possess. Whatever property one of the Levites can redeem, a house sold in a city they possess must be released at the Jubilee, because the house is a Levitical city. The Levitical cities are their possessions among the Israelites. We'll get more into this in the book of Numbers. In other words, there was land mapped out. There were cities and lands mapped out for the priests and given to them tax-free. Verse 34, the open pasture land around the city must not be sold, but it is a permanent possession. If your brother becomes destitute and cannot sustain himself among you, you are to support him as a foreigner or temporary resident so that he can continue to live among you. Unfortunately, in our sinful states, we don't obey this. But notice how God is saying here, we should care for the poor. Okay? Do not profit or take interest from him, but fear your God and let your brother live among you. You are not to lend him your silver with interest or sell him your food for profit. In other words, mark it up. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If your brother among you becomes destitute and sells himself to you, you must not force him to do slave labor. Let him stay with you as a hired hand or a temporary resident. He may work for you until the year of Jubilee. Now this again would be more indentured servant. God is saying you cannot treat him as a regular slave. Okay? You cannot treat him as property. Alright, verse 41. Then he and his children are to be released from you, and he may return to his clan and his ancestral property. They may not be sold as slaves, because they are my slaves that I brought out of the land of Egypt. Now, when God speaks like this, it's a sort of euphemism in terms of how he speaks, right? They are his, they are his servants. But anyway, verse 43, you are not to rule over them harshly, but fear your God. And that tells us something, that cruel and harsh authority, they are not godly people. Verse 44, your male and female slaves are to be from nations around you. You may purchase male and female slaves. And as I said, we talked about this, can't explain this. It's kind of like, when it comes to the permission by God to own slaves. In other words, he's not abolishing slavery. He just said you cannot own your fellow countrymen or the fellow Israelites. All right. Verse 45, you may also purchase from them the foreigners staying with you, or from their families living among you, those born in the land. These may become your property. This is really what the difference in indentured servant and slavery. And as I said, we dealt with this in terms of the why, and can you fault God? And we dealt with that in another study, but admittedly, yeah, this is kind of a cringy statement right here that God permits slavery instead of abolishing it. Verse 46, you may leave them to your sons after you to inherit property. You can make them slaves for life. For concerning your brothers in Israel, you must not rule over one another harshly. If a foreigner or temporary resident living among you prospers, but your brother living near him becomes destitute and sells himself to the foreigner living among you, or to a member of a foreigner's clan, he has a right of redemption. After he has been sold, one of his brothers may redeem him. His uncle or cousin may redeem him, or any of his close relatives from his clans may redeem him. If he prospers, he may redeem himself. The one who purchased him is to calculate the time that from the year that he sold himself till sums up to him until the year of Jubilee. The price of his sale will be determined by the number of years it will be set for him, and it will be set for him like daily wages of a hired hand. If many years are still left, he must pay his redemption price in portions to them based on the purchase price. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, he will calculate the paid price of his redemption in the portion to this remaining years. He will stay with him like a man hired year by year. A foreign owner is not to rule over him harshly in your sight. If he is not redeemed in any of these ways, he and his children are to be released at the year of Jubilee. For the Israelites are my slave. They are my slave that I bought out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. Now again, the term when God says they are my slaves, they are, you can say the phrase is a euphemism kind of phrase. But this portion, as I said, I'm going to take the time because I'm not going to finish the book of Leviticus today. Okay, so let me just take the time and then go back and kind of deal with this from a Christian perspective. Because, you're going to be confronted with this. Why didn't God end slavery? And this is what I mean. This here is a regulation of slavery. So basically what you have is indentured servant, but you have slaves as property. So yes, we know slavery to be the evil that it is. And even according to God's standard, it is the evil that it is. So why did God allow slavery? So what you have regulated here is the difference between how Israel was to treat a fellow Israelite. Okay? A fellow Israelite. That's the difference. He allows them to say, if they're not an Israelite, you could buy them, you could buy slaves, and then these humans would be property. They had no rights. Okay? So this is just as bad as the Atlantic slave trade that we see in America. The difference between the Atlantic slave trade and this slavery is the Atlantic slave trade singled a particular race, meaning the Africans, the Negro. Here, anyone could be a slave if they weren't strong enough. So what God is saying here is that you could not buy your fellow Israelite. Okay, you cannot buy your fellow Israelite as a slave and treat him as property. So what God is basically saying here is that when it comes to your fellow Israelites, if he kind of falls into the slavery predicament, then treat him as a hired hand. Okay? Treat him as a hired hand. Or we would call it an indentured servant, so that he was able to gain his freedom, and at the very least, the year of Jubilee, everybody went free. So to answer the question, why did God permit the evil of slavery? And not only permit it, regulate it. And the answer is, I don't know. And I'm not trying to be coy. I don't know. And God doesn't give a reason for this. In other words, can we say that God is evil for doing this? Is God unjust for doing this? And my answer is no. But I also cannot give you, and this is why I say this, because until God answers the question, then to be able to say I'm going to charge him without having all of the information, that is where it is wrong. And I know that when it comes to this, that this issue seems like it is a cop-out. But I cannot answer it. Now, am I going to say that it's God? Was God evil for doing this? Just like if I'm able to say that the American slave trade was evil, and those who own slaves were evil, then the question would come down: why can I say God is not evil for then allowing slavery? And I think it's a good question. I just can't answer it. Now, the idea though is the American slave slave masters who claim to be Christians. Here is the interesting thing about this: they cannot claim superiority or justification, because they still would have violated God's principle, because there were American Africans who were slaves. And so if you, and the reason why I say that, because there are some, white evangelicals, there's some white people who try to use the idea that, slavery was just, common, and it was. But if you wanted to claim to be Christian and using the Christian principle, then you could not enslave your fellow countrymen, and certainly you could not enslave Christian. Now, what I do say is, when we come to Christianity, and I'm going to say this, and like I say, I don't think this is a good enough answer, but under the Old Testament, the idea was that God wasn't changing the world because of the sinful nature, the sinful heart. And granted, when it comes to this, to say, yeah, but he didn't have to, regulate slavery, right? And there's a lot of things that I said as we go through the Old Testament, we will not be able to have a moral answer to it. So the only way I can say is that, well, God is still God. And until, and let me just say this, if you read the book of Job and you think you could take God to court, that is a mistake. It's not going to happen. But what I am saying is that until God says, well, this is why I did this, if he chooses to give us his answers. In Scripture, we don't have those answers. So, can I charge God to say that God is evil? Now think about this. Can I charge God and say he's evil just like I would charge an American? No, because God is God. And the difference is that all of the creation of God belongs to God. All of the earth, all of the universe, all of its creatures in it belongs to God. That's the difference. Everything belongs to God. And God can do with it as he pleased. So it would be let me come out because I want to show you something on a larger screen here. So it would be like if I said here, this is my ink pen, I could do with it whatever I want. This is something I can do whatever I want because it's mine. My phone, I can do whatever I want, right? I can do whatever I want with that phone because it's my phone. This is my, mouse. These are my scissors. This is my pen. Right? All of these things are mine. I can do with them what I want. None of them can say, if I choose to throw this against the wall, if I choose to snap this in two, if I choose to write love letters as opposed to scientific letters, right? It's my pen. I can do whatever I want. We are all God's creatures. And like I say, while I know on the subject of slavery that it is not comforting, right? On the subject of slavery, it is not comforting. In other words, to give us a satisfying answers, I'm going to admit that. What I am not foolish enough is to charge God foolishly to say, well, this is what I'm going to say God is. Especially since God hasn't given me all of the facts, all of the information that I need to have. He hasn't given me that. And as I said, when I read things like this, when we read where God says, wipe out everything, right? Wipe out all. We're going to come to the book of Job and what God does to Job. Because what? God is God. And that's the difference. So again, cringeworthy, yes. Question, because wow, what is going on here? And again, I can't answer that. But anyway, God is still God. And that is my kind of answer to that question. All right. I'm going to pick, for real, I'm going to try to close out the book of Leviticus next time in chapters 26 and 27. I'll see you then.